In this edition of the Red and Blue Political Roundup, President Trump is not backing down from comments he made Tuesday, calling the government's response to Hurricane Maria a, quote, incredible, unsung success. On Twitter Wednesday, Mr. Trump said his administration did an underappreciated great job in Puerto Rico while criticizing the island's infrastructure. That drew a sharp rebuke from San Juan's mayor, who said, quote, Trump thinks losing 3,000 lives is a success. Can you imagine what he thinks failure looks like? And on Wednesday, newly released documents revealed the White House took away funding from FEMA and other federal agencies to pay for immigration detention centers. According to documents obtained by Oregon Democratic Senator Jeff Merkley, FEMA lost nearly $10 million from its $15 billion budget. I discussed this with him earlier on Red and Blue. You have called the transfer of funds a scandal, but FEMA told CBS News no disaster relief money was taken from the agency. So why is this a scandal?
Well, what is very clear is the document speaking for itself. That $10 million was taken out of FEMA during the first month of the hurricane season in order to fund an expansion of prison camps in the United States of America. I think Americans during this hurricane season, especially after last year with Irma and Maria and Harvey, want to make sure that we're doing everything possible to be prepared to respond. And two of those accounts within FEMA that it was taken from, one is the response and recovery and one is preparation. Those two accounts clearly are related, and I know some of the press has gotten comments from people outside of FEMA today that have said, yes, absolutely, these funds could have been used to be helpful in terms of preparing for and responding to a potential disaster such as the Hurricane Florence coming down right on the Carolinas right now.
And joining me now is CBSN political reporter Caitlin Huey-Burns. Caitlin, great to see you. So what are the optics of this like, with this information about the funds from FEMA being moved to ICE just as Hurricane Florence is barreling down on the East Coast?
Right. Well, they don't look good. And the administration has said that these funds were not, from FEMA, were not going to go directly to hurricane recovery. But again, obviously, the crisis at the border was something that was huge for this administration. The hurricanes tend to become political liabilities if not handled correctly for the administration as well. We saw, of course, the last hurricane in Puerto Rico killed nearly 3,000 people, according to reports of Hurricane Harvey, which hit Texas. People are still recovering from that. And so while this might be a small portion of FEMA's budget, and even as the administration argues that this wasn't directly for hurricane relief, it still does not look good for this administration.
Sure, and the administration is absolutely in its right to move funds around within the agency. There's nothing illegal going on, but it does tell you something about an administration's priorities, for sure. Now, as Hurricane Florence is barreling down, how could this hurricane impact the midterms, do you think?
Well, it really depends. It is set to hit the East Coast. It really depends on how the administration and how FEMA is able to respond. What's going to be very interesting to keep an eye on, as we did last year, is what the appropriation of funds looks like from Congress. Appropriating funds for hurricane and disaster relief tends to scramble alliances on Capitol Hill. It is something that usually puts Republicans and Democrats together if they're from an area that is affected by it. So that will be something to keep an eye on, especially as the budget fight starts to gear up
Right,
this fall.
And the funding deadline is September 30th. And again, you know, we don't know what's going to happen even in Washington, D.C., if there will be some difficulty for lawmakers traveling in Washington, D.C.
That's right, and they're already at the end of their work week and trying to get back home, and you're having lawmakers from the area assessing what the damage could possibly be. So this is something that is going to they're going to have to prepare for in terms of funding, and these things are very difficult to estimate exactly what that will be and what that will look like.
Now, Wednesday, President Trump signed an executive order issuing sanctions against individuals and other entities who meddle in U.S. elections. Do we know what what is behind this particular executive order?
Well, it's really important to think about the timing right now. We're heading into the midterms. We're in the home stretch, really only 2 months to go. The administration, of course, has been criticized roundly for its response to election meddling. The president, of course, under fire consistently by critics for not handling this appropriately. So this is certainly in response to that. But you're hearing from both Republicans and Democrats that this isn't really enough, that this won't really do much, that it allows sanctions to be put in place against foreign entities that try to meddle in elections, but it doesn't do so immediately, as some like Marco Rubio and Chris Van Hollen have been calling for.
Absolutely. And, you know, midterm elections right around the corner. We heard Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell call these upcoming elections like a knife fight in an alley. Are Republicans, do you get the sense that Republicans are really worried?
Well, they certainly have been worried, and they're concerned, too, that the president is not, ringing the alarm bells to the extent that he should. We focused a lot of our attention on the House, which looks ripe for a Democratic takeover, but we've seen the Senate map more favorable to Republicans. But we're starting to see some polls tighten in some of these key states, even in places that Donald Trump won, where Democrats are trying to defend their seat. So certainly there's some feeling of anxiety among Republicans as it pertains to the Senate that wasn't necessarily there just a month ago.
And we hear that, even President George W. Bush may be going out to campaign. That would be an interesting development. We haven't heard a lot from him.
We haven't heard a lot from him, and he was very unpopular when he left office, and you could argue that the Republican politics of today under Donald Trump are in result a reaction to the Bush style of politics. We saw that kind of referendum play out during the Republican primary. So it will be interesting to see exactly where he goes. There are also reports that he's not planning to campaign for fellow Texan Senator Ted Cruz, who is in a really tight, surprisingly tight race for the Senate in that deep red state.
Caitlin, thank you so much. I'm sorry, we've run out of time. I could talk to you more about this, but we'll talk more later. Thank you so much, Caitlin Huey-Burns.